On the 3rd of September, 1939, a young Englishwoman walked into the Englischer Garten in Munich, sat down on a bench, and pressed a pearl-handled pistol to her temple. The gun was a gift from Adolf Hitler. She pulled the trigger. The bullet entered her skull, but did not kill her. Her name was Unity Mitford, and she was the daughter of a baron, the granddaughter of a diplomat, and one of 6 sisters who had grown up together in the quiet villages of the Cotswolds. By the time that bullet lodged in her brain, one of her sisters had married a fascist in Goebbels' drawing room. Another had run away to fight a communist war in Spain. And a third was on the telephone to MI5, betraying them both. This is the story of 6 sisters raised in the same crumbling English nursery who scattered to the farthest extremes of 20th century politics. And the wreckage they left behind reveals what happens when an entire class loses its reason to exist. Chapter 1. 6 girls and no plan for any of them. Their father had killed 8 men with an entrenching tool at Ypres, and he saw no reason his daughters needed to read books. David Freeman Mitford, 2nd Baron Redesdale, was not a complicated man. He was tall, he was loud, he had a temper that could clear a room in seconds, and he carried inside him the particular damage of a man who had survived the trenches when most of the men he loved had not. He came home from the Western Front in 1918 with a limp, a loathing of foreigners, and absolutely no interest in the modern world. He wanted dogs, fresh air, and silence. What he got instead was 6 daughters. They arrived in sequence over 16 years. Nancy in 1904, Pamela in 1907, Diana in 1910, Unity in 1914, Jessica in 1917, and Deborah, the baby, in 1920. There was a son too, Tom, born in 1909, the only boy, the one who mattered in the arithmetic of inheritance. Because in the world the Mitfords inhabited, sons carried the title and the land. Daughters were beautiful problems to be solved through marriage. Their mother, Sidney Bowles, had married David in 1904 when she was just 24. She was the daughter of Thomas Gibson Bowles, a journalist, magazine founder, and member of Parliament. Sidney was practical, reserved, and deeply private. Where David roared, Sidney went quiet. Where David acted on instinct, Sidney calculated. She ran the household with cool efficiency. She believed in fresh air, whole milk, and the absolute minimum of formal education. This last conviction shaped everything that followed. The Mitford girls were not sent to school. Not to boarding school, not to day school, not to any school at all. David considered it a waste of money. Sidney considered it unnecessary. They hired governesses instead, a parade of them, each one lasting a shorter time than the last. The girls tormented them. They hid in cupboards, they released pet snakes during French lessons, they staged elaborate mutinies. One governess fled after 3 weeks, another lasted barely longer. The family's homes tracked a slow decline common to the English gentry in the years between the wars. They began at Batsford Park, in Gloucester, a grand pile with gardens designed in the Japanese style by David's father, the 1st Baron Redesdale, who had spent years as a diplomat in Tokyo. Batsford had 35 bedrooms. It had pagodas in the grounds and a bamboo grove that grew to enormous height. But maintaining it cost a fortune, and the Redesdale fortune was not enormous. David's father had spent freely. David inherited debts alongside. The numbers tell the story of a class under pressure. In 1880, a landed estate of 10,000 acres might generate an annual income of £10,000, enough to sustain a household of 40 servants, a stable of 20 horses, and a London season costing £1,000 each spring. By 1920, agricultural rents had collapsed. Land that earned £1 an acre before the war now earned half that. Death duties, first introduced in 1894 at a rate of 8%, had risen to 40% by 1919. Every generation that died handed the treasury a larger slice of the family's capital. David sold Batsford in 1919. He moved the family to Asthall Manor in Oxfordshire, a handsome Jacobean house of honey-colored stone set in the Windrush Valley. It was smaller than Batsford, more manageable, but still a gentleman's residence, with stables and gardens and land enough to keep up appearances. Here, in the early 1920s, the 6 Mitford girls spent what all of them would later describe as the happiest years of their lives, and here the paradox began. David and Sydney, by denying their daughters a formal education, by trapping them in a beautiful rural isolation with nothing but each other and their own imaginations, created a pressure cooker of intelligence, boredom, and ambition that would eventually blow apart. 6 girls, no plan for any of them, no training, no qualifications, no preparation for a world that was already changing faster than their parents could understand. The only plan was marriage. The only ambition deemed appropriate was to marry well. And when that proved insufficient for 6 of the most restless, intelligent, and willful women of their generation, each of them went looking for something. What they found would horrify the world. Chapter 2, the linen cupboard at the center of the world. Underneath the stairs at Asthall Manor, behind the sheets and blankets, 6 children built a civilization. They called it the Hans Society. The name came from the courtesy title each daughter bore as the child of a baron. They were all honorable. And so the cupboard under the stairs became the Hans cupboard, a tiny, cramped, linen-scented republic where the sisters held court, made laws, passed judgment, and invented a private language so elaborate that outsiders could not follow a single sentence. Nancy, the eldest, was the presiding genius of cruelty. She was sharp, funny, and merciful. She teased her younger sisters until they cried, then teased them for crying. She invented nicknames that stuck for life. She told Diana, the most beautiful of them all, that she had been found in the road as a baby and was not really a Mitford at all. Diana believed her for years. Nancy's wit was a weapon she sharpened every day on the people closest to her. It was also the instrument of her survival. She would eventually turn her family into some of the most celebrated comic fiction in the English language. But in the 1920s, she was simply the cleverest girl in a household that gave her no outlet for her cleverness. Pamela was the quiet one, the one the others sometimes forgot to mention. She loved animals, farming, and the countryside with a deep, uncomplicated devotion. She was not interested in politics, or literature, or London society. She wanted horses and dogs and a good kitchen garden. In a family of extremists, Pamela's moderation was its own form of rebellion. Diana was the beauty. Even as a child, everyone who met her remarked on it. She had pale gold hair, enormous blue eyes, and a composure that made her seem older than her years. She read widely and thought carefully. She was, by every account, the most intellectually gifted of the sisters after Nancy. And she carried inside her a hunger for intensity, for the extraordinary, for the company of remarkable men. That would lead her to the darkest dinner tables in Europe. Unity was the problem child. She was enormous. She grew to nearly 6 feet tall. She was clumsy, loud, disruptive, and possessed of an absolute determination to be noticed. She once took her pet rat, Ratchular, to a formal luncheon. She let grass snakes loose in the drawing room. She was expelled from every school she briefly attended. Her middle names were Valkyrie and Freeman. Valkyrie, she had been conceived in Swastika, Ontario, a small Canadian mining town named long before the symbol carried its later meaning. But the coincidence delighted Unity as she grew older, and she wore it like a prophecy. Jessica was the rebel. From childhood, she positioned herself in opposition to everything her family represented. She saved pennies in a drawer, her running away fund, coins accumulated one by one against the day she would escape. She read Marx while her sisters read society magazines. She argued politics at the dinner table with a ferocity that left David purple-faced and shouting. In the private mythology of the Hans cupboard, Jessica cast herself as the outsider, the one who saw through the privilege, the one who would lead. Deborah, the youngest, watched it all with wide eyes and a talent for understatement that would serve her well. She was cheerful, practical, and possessed of an emotional intelligence the others often lacked. She adored Elvis Presley, chickens, and her father. She would become the only one of the six to build something that lasted. The Hans cupboard was not merely a game, it was a rehearsal. Each sister tried on her future self in that tiny space. Nancy practiced her savage commentary, Unity practiced her provocations, Jessica practiced her dissent. They fought, allied, betrayed, and reconciled in patterns they would repeat on a far larger stage. In 1926, David sold Asthall Manor and built a new house at a village 2 miles away. Swinbrook House was designed by David himself, a graceless, functional building the children loathed on sight. Nancy called it Swinebrook. The bedrooms were small and cold, the views were magnificent, but the house itself had none of the warmth of Asthall. The sisters felt imprisoned, and one by one, they began to plot their escape. The Mitford household spent roughly £400 a year on the girls' governesses, roughly a tenth of what a single year at a good boarding school would have cost for each child. David sent Tom to Eton at an annual fee of around £200 per term. The discrepancy was not cruelty, it was arithmetic. An eldest son needed connections that only the right school could provide. Daughters needed only to be marriageable. That these particular daughters needed far more than marriage could offer was a possibility that never seems to have occurred to either parent. What the linen cupboard produced, through neglect and accident and the strange alchemy of sisterhood, was 6 women of extraordinary force. Each one would leave that cupboard and enter the 20th century with the unshakable conviction that the rules did not apply to her. They were right about that, but not in the way any of them imagined. Chapter 3, the season that scattered them forever. One by one, the Mitford girls stepped out of the Cotswolds and into a world that was already on fire. Nancy went first. She was presented at court in 1923, the traditional ritual by which daughters of the aristocracy were introduced to the marriage market. She wore white. She curtsied to the king. And then she went out into London and discovered that she was not merely clever, but brilliantly, dangerously funny. She fell in with the bright young things, the glittering, reckless circle of young aristocrats who drank too much, drove too fast, and threw costume parties that made the newspapers. Evelyn Waugh was her friend. John Betjeman came to Swinbrook and fell hopelessly in love with her. She danced, she flirted, and she began to write. Her first novel, Highland Fling, appeared in 1931. It was light, sharp, and observant. It drew shamelessly on her family and her social circle. It was not a masterpiece, but it announced a voice. Nancy had found her weapon. She could turn pain into comedy. She could take the strangeness of her upbringing and make it into art. It was a trick that would save her sanity more than once in the years ahead. Diana's escape was more dramatic. In 1928, at the age of 18, she married Brian Guinness, heir to the brewing fortune. He was handsome, kind, cultured, and enormously rich. Their wedding was the social event of the season. Their house in Buckingham Street became a salon for writers, artists, and intellectuals. Lytton Strachey visited. Augustus John painted Diana's portrait. Evelyn Waugh dedicated vile bodies to them. Diana had everything a young woman of her class could want: wealth, beauty, admiration, and a husband who adored her. She was bored within 2 years. The Guinness fortune was staggering by any measure. Brian's annual income exceeded £30,000, roughly equivalent to £2 million in today's money. Their London house was staffed with 14 servants. They kept a country estate in Hampshire. Diana wore couture gowns and received invitations to every drawing room in England. And none of it was enough. She wanted something bigger. something that matched the scale of what she felt inside. In 1932, she found it. At a house party, Diana met Sir Oswald Mosley, the most charismatic and most dangerous politician in Britain. Mosley was married. He was a serial philanderer. He had abandoned the Labour Party to found his own movement, and he had just returned from Italy, where he had studied Mussolini's fascist state and decided to build one in England. Diana fell for him completely. She left Brian Guinness, breaking his heart and scandalizing society. She abandoned her 2 small sons. She walked away from one of the greatest fortunes in England to become the mistress of a married fascist. The Guinness family was furious. David and Sidney were appalled, though for different reasons. David loathed Mosley personally. Sidney, who would later develop her own sympathies for Hitler's Germany, objected mainly to the disgrace. Meanwhile, the younger sisters watched and learned. Unity, still a teenager, saw in Diana's boldness a template for her own future. Jessica, equally observant, saw in the family's growing flirtation with the far-right everything she despised. The dinner table at Swinbrook became a battlefield. David shouted. Sidney went silent. Nancy made ask. Unity and Jessica screamed at each other about Hitler and Stalin until the dishes shook. Tom, the only brother, tried to keep the peace. He was gentle, musical, and beloved by all 6 sisters. He had studied in Vienna and Berlin. He spoke fluent German. He understood both sides of the argument that was tearing his family apart, and it gave him no comfort at all. By 1933, the scattering was complete. Nancy was writing in London. Diana was living openly with Mosley. Unity had discovered Hitler and was preparing to follow him to Munich. Jessica was reading communist pamphlets and adding pennies to her running away fund. Pamela was quietly farming in Gloucestershire. And Deborah, still only 13, was watching her family fracture along lines she could not yet understand. 6 sisters who had shared a linen cupboard now occupied entirely different worlds. The genteel poverty of the Cotswolds had produced a novelist, a farmer, a fascist's mistress, a Nazi devotee, a communist, and a future duchess. The forces that would drive them to their separate extremes were already in motion. All that remained was the decade that would prove whether conviction was the same thing as courage. It was not. But they would not learn that for years. Chapter 4. The Beauty Who Chose the Black Shirt. Diana Mitford left the richest young man in England for a married fascist, and she did it without a moment's hesitation. To understand Diana's choice, you must first understand what Oswald Mosley offered that Brian Guinness could not. Brian was decent, wealthy, and kind. Mosley was electric. He was the finest orator in British politics. He could hold a crowd of 15,000 in the palm of his hand. He had been the youngest member of Parliament, elected at 21. He had crossed the floor from Conservative to Labour and back again, not from weakness, but from an impatient conviction that every existing party was too slow, too cautious, too afraid to act. He was tall, dark, handsome in the matinee idol fashion of the era, and absolutely certain that he was destined to lead Britain. Diana shared that certainty. She saw in Mosley not just a lover, but a world historical figure. She believed, with a conviction that never wavered for the rest of her life, that Mosley was the greatest man of his age, and that history had conspired to deny him his rightful place. This was not mere infatuation. It was something colder and more durable. Diana chose Mosley the way she might have chosen a religion, completely, without reservation, without the possibility of doubt. In October 1932, Mosley founded the British Union of Fascists. He modeled it explicitly on Mussolini's movement. There were black shirts, there were marches, there were rallies at Olympia in London where hecklers were beaten by stewards while the audience... The buff attracted a following that peaked at roughly 50,000 members in 1934. Lord Rothermere's Daily Mail ran the headline "Hurrah" for the black shirts. For a brief, alarming moment, it seemed as though Britain might follow Italy and Germany into the darkness. Diana was at the center of it all. She attended every rally. She hosted Mosley's inner circle at her flat in Eaton Square. She used her beauty and her social connections to open doors that would have remained closed to Mosley alone. She traveled repeatedly to Germany, where she cultivated a personal relationship with Adolf Hitler, not because she was ordered to, but because she wanted to. Diana was not a follower. She was a true believer. The wedding, when it came, was a masterpiece of ideological theater. On the 6th of October, 1936, Diana Mitford married Oswald Mosley in the drawing room of Joseph Goebbels' house in Berlin. Hitler was a guest. He gave the couple a framed photograph of himself in a silver frame, which Diana displayed in her home for the rest of her life. The ceremony was secret. Even David and Sydney did not know until afterwards. The marriage was not publicly acknowledged for nearly 2 years. Consider the scene for a moment. The daughter of an English baron, granddaughter of a man who had sat in Parliament, great-granddaughter of generations of country gentlemen and clergymen, standing in the home of the Nazi propaganda minister, exchanging vows in the presence of the man who was already planning the destruction of European civilization, and doing so willingly. Eagerly, with a smile that witnesses remembered decades later, the British security services were watching. MI5 had opened a file on Mosley in 1933. Diana's name appeared in it almost immediately. An intelligence assessment written during this period described her in terms that cut through every polite euphemism. She was, the file said, far cleverer and more dangerous than her husband. The analyst understood what many of Mosley's supporters did not. Mosley was a showman. Diana was an ideologue. Mosley wanted power. Diana wanted to reshape the world. The Guinness family responded to Diana's departure with cold fury. Brian was granted custody of their 2 sons, Jonathan and Desmond. Diana was largely cut off from the Guinness fortune. She did not care. She had Mosley. She had the cause. She had the absolute certainty of a woman who had weighed comfort against conviction and found comfort wanting. The social cost was enormous. Friends dropped her. Invitations ceased. The London drawing rooms that had once competed for her presence closed their doors. Diana accepted this with the composure that defined her. She never complained. She never explained. She never apologized. This refusal to apologize would become the defining characteristic of her public life, sustained without a crack for more than 70 years, right up to her death in 2003 at the age of 93. David and Sydney were now confronted with a problem they had no tools to solve. Their most beautiful daughter had married a fascist in Nazi Germany. Their response revealed the fault line that would eventually destroy their own marriage. David was appalled by Mosley. He considered him a cad and a fraud. But David's objection was personal, not political. He did not understand fascism as an ideology. He understood it as bad manners. Sydney's response was more troubling. She visited Germany, she met Hitler, and she came home speaking of him with a warmth that alarmed everyone who heard it. Sydney found in Hitler a man who shared her beliefs in fresh air, vegetarianism, and the simple life. She appears to have filtered out everything else. This was not stupidity. Sydney was an intelligent woman. It was something more dangerous. It was the capacity of a certain kind of English person to see in a foreign dictator only what confirmed their existing prejudices. But Diana's story was only the beginning, because while Diana was building her life around Mosley and Hitler, her younger sister Unity was doing something far more extreme. Diana at least maintained a coherent political program. She believed in fascism as a system of government. Unity's attachment to Hitler was not political at all. It was personal, it was obsessive, and it would end with a bullet. Chapter 5, 140 Afternoons with the Führer. Unity Mitford sat in the same Munich restaurant, at the same table, day after day, until Adolf Hitler finally looked up. She arrived in Munich in the summer of 1934. She was 19 years old. She had enrolled at a language school, ostensibly to improve her German. Her real purpose was singular and absolute. She intended to meet Adolf Hitler and to become part of his inner circle. She had no connections, no introductions, no strategy beyond the blunt force of her own will. She simply went to the Osteria Bavaria, the restaurant where Hitler was known to lunch, and sat there. Day after day, week after week. Watching, waiting, it took months. Hitler noticed the tall, striking English girl who appeared at the same table every afternoon. He asked who she was. He was told she was the daughter of a British baron. He was intrigued. On the 9th of February, 1935, he sent an aide to invite her to his table. Unity recorded the event in her diary with meticulous precision. She would go on to record every subsequent meeting with the same care. The diaries, discovered in 2024 in the attic of a relative's house, revealed something that historians had long suspected but could not prove. Unity met Hitler approximately 140 times over the next 4 years. She marked each meeting in her diary. Meetings she considered especially significant were recorded in red ink. The word she used most often to describe Hitler was angel. The relationship between Unity and Hitler has been debated for decades. There is no evidence that it was sexual. What it appears to have been was something perhaps more disturbing. Unity offered Hitler something that his political associates and military advisors could not. She offered unconditional adoration. She was young, aristocratic, foreign, and utterly without guile. She worshipped him with a purity of devotion that even the most fanatical party members could not match, because she had come to him freely, across national borders, abandoning her own country and class to serve his vision. Hitler, in return, gave Unity access to the innermost circles of the Nazi elite. She attended the Nuremberg rallies as his personal guest. She sat in his box at the Bayreuth Festival. She was given a flat in Munich, reportedly confiscated from a Jewish family. She dined with Goebbels, with Himmler, with Streicher. She moved through the machinery of the Third Reich like a tourist in a cathedral, marveling at the architecture and blind to the bones in the foundations. Her anti-Semitism was not merely social or theoretical. In 1935, Unity wrote a letter to Der Stürmer, the most violently anti-Semitic publication in Germany. In it, she praised the Nazi regime's treatment of Jews and expressed her solidarity with the cause. The letter was published. It was reported in the British press. Her family was horrified. David wrote her furious letters. Sidney, characteristically, tried to change the subject. MI5 opened a file on Unity in 1934. The file grew thick over the following years. British intelligence was less concerned with Unity's personal devotion to Hitler than with the possibility that she was being used as a channel of communication between the Nazi leadership and sympathetic elements in British society. Unity was not a spy in any formal sense. She was too guileless for espionage. But her presence in Hitler's circle gave the Nazis a direct line to the British aristocracy, and that was a tool they knew how to use. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, was jealous. She referred to Unity as the Valkyrie, with undisguised contempt. She complained to friends that Hitler paid too much attention to the English girl. Whether this jealousy was romantic or territorial is unclear. What is clear is that Unity's presence in Hitler's court was real enough and sustained enough to provoke genuine resentment from the woman who would eventually die beside him in the bunker. The years between 1935 and 1939 represent the strangest period in the already strange history of the Mitford family. Two sisters, Diana and Unity, were now embedded in the highest reaches of the Nazi regime. A third, Jessica, had eloped to Spain to support the communist cause. Nancy was watching it all from London with mounting horror and recording everything. Pamela was raising chickens. Deborah was trying to have a normal adolescence. At the height of Unity's time in Munich, the dimensions of the Mitford story become almost impossible to believe. One family, 6 sisters, 2 aligned with fascism, 1 with communism, 1 secretly informing for British intelligence, 1 farming, 1 about to marry into one of the grandest dukedoms in England. The ideological range was not merely broad, it was the full span of European politics in the 1930s, represented in a single family photograph. Unity's diaries record more than her meetings with Hitler. They record a daily life that mixed the banal and the monstrous with the unself-consciousness of a very young woman who had never been taught to question her own impulses. She shopped. She attended the opera. She had her hair done. And she attended rallies where thousands screamed for the annihilation of European Jewry. Back in England, the family watched Unity's transformation with varying degrees of alarm. Nancy was horrified, but not surprised. She had always known Unity was capable of extremes. Diana was supportive, seeing in Unity's devotion to Hitler a mirror of her own commitment to the cause. Jessica was she wrote Unity letters arguing, pleading, condemning. Unity wrote back with cheerful certainty. They were sisters arguing across the widest ideological gulf in Europe, and neither could hear a word the other said. David's response was characteristically blunt. He forbade Unity to return to Germany. Unity ignored him. He threatened to cut off her allowance. Sydney overruled him. He raged. He shouted. He slammed doors. And Unity went back to Munich on the next available train. David's authority, absolute in theory, was meaningless in practice. He could not control a daughter who had found a purpose larger than his anger. The British public followed Unity's exploits with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. The newspapers reported her attendance at Nazi events. Photographs showed her giving the Hitler salute, beaming, draped in swastika badges. Questions were asked in Parliament about whether the government was aware that a British subject of noble birth was acting as an unofficial ambassador for the Nazi regime. The government replied that Miss Mitford was a private citizen and her activities were her own affair. The question that hangs over Unity's story is the question that hangs over the entire Mitford saga. How did the linen cupboard produce this? How did the daughter of an English baron, raised on ponies and governesses and walks in the Cotswolds, end up writing fan letters to Der Stürmer and calling Adolf Hitler her angel? The answer is not complicated. It is terrifying in its simplicity. Unity was given no education, no moral framework, no intellectual tools, and no purpose. She was given only the absolute confidence that comes from being born into the ruling class. She went looking for meaning. And she found it in the most monstrous place the 20th century had to offer. By the summer of 1939, war was inevitable. Unity knew it. She had told friends and family that if England and Germany went to war, she would kill herself. No one believed her. They should have. Chapter 6, The Sister Who Called MI5. While Diana sat in Goebbels' parlor and Unity attended the Nuremberg rallies, Nancy picked up the telephone and rang British intelligence. The precise circumstances of Nancy's approach to MI5 remain partially obscured by the conventions of British secrecy. What is known is that by the late 1930s, Nancy was providing information to the security services about her own sisters. She told them about Diana's visits to Germany. She told them about Unity's relationship with Hitler. She described the conversations she had overheard, the guests who came to dinner, the letters that arrived with German postmarks and swastika stamps. Nancy's motivations were layered. She was genuinely alarmed by what her sisters were doing. She was patriotic in the quiet, undemonstrative way of her class. She also harbored a deep and complicated resentment toward Diana, the sister who was more beautiful, more admired, and who had taken the family's attention away from Nancy with the sheer force of her choices. Betraying Diana to MI5 was at once an act of conscience and an act of revenge. Nancy would have understood the duality. She understood everything. The MI5 file that resulted from Nancy's information and from the service's own surveillance contained the assessment that has followed Diana ever since. Diana Mosley, the file stated, was far cleverer and more dangerous than her husband. The intelligence officers who compiled the file understood something essential. Oswald Mosley was a demagogue, but he was also vain, disorganized, and ultimately ineffective. Diana was focused, disciplined, and possessed of a strategic intelligence that made her a genuine security concern. She had personal access to Hitler. She had social access to the British establishment. She was, in the assessment of the professionals whose job it was to protect the state, a potential conduit for Nazi influence at the highest levels of British society. While Nancy was quietly informing on her sisters, the fourth act of the Mitford drama was unfolding 3,000 miles away. Jessica, the rebel of the linen cupboard, had run. In 1937, at the age of 19, Jessica eloped with Esmond Romilly. Romilly was Winston Churchill's nephew. He was also a self-declared communist who had run away from Wellington College at 15, published a scandalous magazine exposing the conditions at English public schools, and fought in the international brigades during the Spanish Civil War. He was brave, reckless, charming, and difficult. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man a Mitford would choose. Jessica and Esmond fled to Spain. Not to the beaches. Jessica, who had never worked a day in her life, who had been raised in a household with servants and silver and the expectation that she would marry a suitable young man, found herself in a country torn apart by civil conflict. She loved it. For the first time, she felt she was doing something that mattered. The abstract principles she had argued at the Swinbrook dinner table were suddenly real. People were fighting and dying for the ideas she had read about in her communist pamphlets. The Running Away Fund had delivered on its promise. Esmond was already a veteran. He had fought with the international brigades at the Battle of Boadilla, where he had been wounded and many of his comrades killed. He was only 18 when Jessica found him, but he had already seen things that most people twice his age could not imagine. Together, they made a formidable and improbable pair, the Baron's daughter and the renegade nephew of Winston Churchill, united by a contempt for the world they had been born into, and a conviction that a better one could be built. The reaction in England was immediate and extreme. David was apoplectic. He was losing daughters to political extremism at a rate of roughly one per year. First Diana to fascism, then unity to Hitler. Now Jessica to communism. The newspapers, which had been covering the Mitford family with increasing fascination, treated Jessica's elopement as front-page news. A baron's daughter had run off with a communist to a war zone. It was irresistible. David used every connection he had. He contacted the Foreign Office. He demanded action. And remarkably, a Royal Navy destroyer was dispatched to retrieve his daughter. The image is worth pausing over. The might of the British fleet diverted to collect a teenage aristocrat from a Spanish port because her father was angry. It captures something essential about the world the Mitfords inhabited. Their class still had the power to move warships. It just no longer had the power to control its own children. Jessica refused to come home. She married Esmond in Bayonne, France, in May 1937. Peter Neville, the British consul, attended. Nancy sent a telegram. David sent nothing. The 3 years between Jessica's elopement and the outbreak of war were the years in which the Mitford family existed in its most extraordinary configuration. Diana was married to Mosley and visiting Hitler. Unity was living in Munich, attending rallies and recording her meetings in red ink. Jessica was in London and then America, organizing for communist causes. Nancy was dining with her sisters, noting their indiscretions, and passing information to the security services. Pamela was in Gloucestershire, managing a farm. Deborah was being courted by Lord Andrew Cavendish, second son of the 10th Duke of Devonshire. Sidney and David's marriage, already strained, began to crack along the same ideological line that divided their daughters. Sydney's sympathies lay with Germany. David's, when war finally became inevitable, swung back to a fierce, unquestioning patriotism. They could not agree, they could not compromise, they could not even discuss it. By 1940, they were living apart. They would never fully reconcile. And then the day came. The 3rd of September, 1939. Neville Chamberlain's voice on the wireless announcing that Britain was at war with Germany. In London, Diana heard the news and understood that her husband would be arrested. In Gloucestershire, Pamela carried on milking the cows. In America, Jessica celebrated. In Swinbrook, David wept, because he had fought the last war and knew what this one would cost. In Munich, Unity Mitford walked to the Englischer Garten, sat down, took out the pearl-handled pistol Adolf Hitler had given her, and shot herself in the head. The bullet entered her right temple. It lodged in her brain. It did not kill her. Nothing about the Mitford story is simple. Not even the ending Unity chose for herself. Chapter 7. The bullet that would not kill. They brought Unity home on a stretcher in January 1940, and the woman they found was not the woman who had left. Hitler arranged her repatriation. Even in the chaos of the war's first months, with his armies massing on the borders of Western Europe, he took the time to ensure that the English girl who had loved him was returned safely to her family. She was transported through Switzerland, a neutral corridor between the war's two sides. A special ambulance carried her to the Swiss border. A British consular official met her there. Sydney traveled to collect her daughter. What she found shocked even a woman accustomed to Unity's provocations. Unity was conscious, but barely functional. The bullet had destroyed portions of her brain responsible for higher reasoning, emotional regulation, and impulse control. She could walk, but unsteadily. She could speak, but in broken sentences. She could recognize her family, but she could not sustain a conversation. The tall, forceful, impossible young woman who had stalked Adolf Hitler across Munich was gone. In her place was someone who resembled a large, bewildered child. Deborah, the youngest sister, saw Unity shortly after her return. Decades later, she described the encounter. Unity had huge eyes and matted hair. She was incontinent. She laughed at inappropriate moments. She asked the same questions repeatedly. She had no understanding of the war, of what had happened, of why she was back in England. She still spoke of Hitler with affection, but in a vague, disconnected way, as one might speak of a character in a dream. The medical reality was bleak. The bullet could not be safely removed. It sat in Unity's brain like a seed, slowly poisoning her. Surgeons examined her and concluded that any attempt at extraction would kill her. She was condemned to a twilight existence, alive but not living, present but not whole. David and Sydney took her to Inchkenneth, a tiny island off the west coast of Scotland that David had bought in 1938. It was remote, windswept, and far from the newspapers that had made Unity's name notorious. Here, in a cottage with no electricity and limited running water, they cared for their damaged daughter. David, who had raged against Unity's politics, who had forbidden her name to be spoken in his presence, now devoted himself to her care with a tenderness that surprised everyone who knew him. The cost was measured in more than money. David was 62 when Unity came home. Sydney was 59. They were elderly by the standards of their era. Caring for an incontinent, brain-damaged adult daughter was physically exhausting. It was also emotionally devastating. Every day, Unity's condition reminded them of the daughter she had been, the choices she had made, and the catastrophe that had followed. Unity lived for 9 more years. She died on the 30th of May, 1948, at the West Highland Cottage Hospital in Oban. The cause of death was meningitis, caused by swelling around the bullet that still sat in her brain. She was 33 years old. She had spent almost a quarter of her life in the diminished state the bullet had imposed. The newspapers that had once followed her every movement barely reported her death. The world had moved on. The war had ended. The concentration camps had been liberated. The full scale of the horror that Unity had cheered was now public knowledge. The 6 million dead, the gas chambers, the industrial machinery of genocide that Unity had walked past, blind and smiling, on her way to dinner with the Fuhrer. In the light of Nuremberg, Unity Mitford's story was no longer scandalous. It was simply pathetic. She was buried in the churchyard at Swinbrook. The grave is simple. It bears her name, her dates, and nothing else. No mention of Hitler, no mention of Munich, no mention of the pearl-handled pistol, or the Englischer Garten, or the 140 afternoons in the Osteria Bavaria. Just a name in a country churchyard, surrounded by the Oxfordshire hills where she had once kept pet snakes and terrorized governesses and dreamed of something larger than the life she had been given. The family that survived Unity's slow death was not the family that had gathered at Swinbrook in the 1920s. It was a collection of fragments. David and Sidney were separated. Tom was dead. Diana was in prison. Jessica was in America. Nancy was in London, writing furiously, turning everything she had witnessed into fiction because it was the only way she could bear it. Between 1939 and 1948, the Mitford family absorbed a sequence of blows that would have destroyed most households. A daughter shot in the head, a son killed in the war, a daughter imprisoned without trial, a marriage ended, a fortune diminished, and through it all, the particular English expectation that one would carry on, keep up appearances, and never, under any circumstances, make a scene. The bullet that would not kill Unity became a metaphor for the family itself, damaged beyond repair, still functioning, still, in some terrible way, alive, #Chapter 8, Holloway, Oakland, and the ruins of a family. In 1940, Diana Mosley was locked in Holloway Prison without charge, and 3,000 miles away, Jessica Mitford joined the Communist Party. The mechanism of Diana's imprisonment was Defense Regulation 18B, a wartime measure that allowed the government to detain anyone it considered a threat to national security. No trial. No hearing. No right. Diana was arrested on the 29th of June, 1940, 11 weeks after her husband. She was taken to Holloway, the women's prison in North London, and locked in a cell. She was 30 years old. Her youngest son, Max, was 11 weeks old. He had been born on April the 15th, just 2 months before her arrest. She was separated from him and from her older son, Alexander, who was 2. The baby was eventually allowed to join her in prison, but her older children were cared for by relatives. Diana would not see them regularly for 3 years. The conditions at Holloway were grim. Diana's cell was small, cold, and infested with bedbugs. The food was poor. Exercise was limited to a short walk in the prison yard. Diana, who had dined with Hitler and danced at embassy balls, now ate prison porridge and sewed mailbags. She bore it with the same composure she brought to everything. She did not complain. She did not recant. She did not offer to renounce her political beliefs in exchange for release. The authorities noted her demeanor with something approaching frustration. A prisoner who cooperated might be released early. Diana had no intention of cooperating. The Mosleys were eventually permitted to share a married couple's quarters within Holloway. This arrangement, when it became public, caused outrage. The perception that fascist aristocrats were receiving special treatment while ordinary Britons suffered the Blitz was politically toxic. Questions were asked in Parliament. Herbert Morrison, the Home Secretary, faced calls for their continued detention. The Mosleys were released in November 1943 on grounds of Oswald's poor health and placed under house arrest for the remainder of the war. Their release prompted a protest rally in London. 20,000 people signed a petition demanding they be returned to prison. While Diana served her sentence, Jessica was building an entirely new life in America. She and Esmond Romilly had emigrated in 1939, settling first in New York, then in Washington, then in Miami. Esmond was restless, taking odd jobs and schemes, unable to settle. When war broke out, he joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and was killed in November 1941. Shot down over the North Sea during a bombing raid on Hamburg. He was 23. Jessica was devastated but not defeated. She was 24 years old, a widow with a young daughter, in a country she barely knew. Most women in her position would have gone home. Jessica did not consider it. England meant her family, and her family meant arguments about Hitler. She stayed. She moved to Oakland, California, where she reinvented herself with the determination that characterized every Mitford. She met and married Robert Treuhaft, a labor lawyer and fellow communist. He was warm, funny, principled, and exactly the intellectual partner Jessica needed. Together, they became fixtures of the Oakland left. She joined the Communist Party of the United States. She became deeply involved in the civil rights movement, organizing in the segregated South, marching, petitioning, and confronting the racial injustice that she saw as the American equivalent of the class system she had fled. Jessica's commitment was not theoretical. She and Robert represented black defendants in Oakland courts. They organized voter registration drives in Mississippi. They went to places where white allies were unwelcome and sometimes in danger. Jessica, who had grown up in a household where the gardener was addressed by his surname and the cook was invisible, now worked alongside black Americans fighting for basic rights. The transformation was genuine and complete. The running away pennies had taken her further than she could ever have imagined. The contrast between the two sisters' wartime experiences is almost too neat. Diana in a British prison for supporting fascism, Jessica in an American city fighting for communism. Both utterly convinced they were right. Both willing to sacrifice comfort, reputation, and family for their beliefs. Both displaying the particular Mitford quality that Nancy once described as being unable to see any point of view other than one's own. Tom Mitford died in Burma on the 30th of March, 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe ended. He was 36. He had served with the Devonshire Regiment and was killed in action during the advance on Mandalay. His death devastated every member of the family. Diana said she never recovered from it. Nancy's grief was private but deep. Jessica, who had loved Tom tenderly despite their political differences, received the news in California and wept. Tom had been the peacemaker, the one who understood all six sisters, the one who could translate between their warring factions. His death removed the last person capable of holding the family together. After Tom, the Mitfords were not a family in any functional sense. They were six women connected by blood and separated by everything else. David and Sydney's separation became permanent during the war years. David retreated to Inchkenneth with Nanny Bloor, the childhood nurse who had raised all 7 Mitford children. Sydney kept Swinbrook and continued to defend her visits to Hitler's Germany with the same calm immovability she brought to arguments about fresh air and raw milk. David died in 1958, Sydney in 1963. Neither fully understood what had happened to their children. Neither accepted responsibility for it. The ruins were extensive. A daughter dead from a self-inflicted bullet, a son killed in combat, a daughter imprisoned, a daughter exiled in America, a family name synonymous with political extremism. And yet, from these ruins, 2 extraordinary acts of rebuilding were about to begin. One would involve a pen, the other, a farm shop. Chapter 9. The Duchess Who Inherited a Catastrophe. Deborah Mitford had expected to be terrifically poor, and then death handed her one of the largest estates in England and a tax bill that could destroy it. In 1941, Deborah had married Lord Andrew Cavendish, the second son of the 10th Duke of Devonshire. Second sons did not inherit. Second sons made their own way. Deborah was content with this. She had no interest in great houses or grand titles. She wanted a farm, some chickens, and a manageable life. Then, on the 7th of September, 1944, Andrew's elder brother William, Marquess of Hartington, was killed by a German sniper in Belgium. William had married Kathleen Kennedy, sister of the future American president, just 4 months earlier. His death shattered both families. It also changed everything for Deborah and Andrew. Suddenly, Andrew was the heir to the Devonshire dukedom. When the 10th Duke died in 1950, Andrew became the 11th Duke, Deborah became the Duchess of Devonshire, and they inherited Chatsworth. Chatsworth is not merely a house, it is a statement. Built between 1687 and 1707 for the first Duke of Devonshire, it sits in 105 acres of gardens, designed by Capability Brown. Surrounded by a park of 1,000 acres in the Derbyshire Peaks, it contains 126 rooms. Its art collection includes works by Rembrandt, Van Dyck, Veronese, and Lucian Freud. Its library holds over 20,000 volumes. It is one of the greatest treasure houses in England. It was also, in 1950, a catastrophe. The 10th Duke died on the 26th of November, 1950. He died just 14 weeks before a family trust was due to take effect that would have sheltered the estate from death duties. 14 weeks. The timing was devastating. Without the trust, the full weight of the estate duty fell on the inheritance. The rate in 1950 was 80%. The assessed value of the estate was roughly £7.5 million. The duty owed was approximately £3 million, equivalent to over $100 million in today's money. £3 million. In an era when a comfortable middle-class family might earn £500 a year, when a country house servant earned perhaps £60 per annum. £3 million was not a tax bill. It was a death sentence for the estate. Andrew and Deborah had 3 options. They could sell Chatsworth and its contents entirely, walking away from 3 centuries of family history. They could hand the house and its collections to the National Trust, surrendering family control forever. Or they could try to pay the duty, a process that would consume 2 decades and require the sale of tens of thousands of acres, some of the greatest artworks in private hands, and an entire second stately home. They chose to fight. The decision was not sentimental. Andrew and Deborah understood that Chatsworth was not simply a home. It was an employer, a community, and a repository of national heritage. If they walked away, hundreds of people would lose their livelihoods. The art collection would be scattered to museums around the world. The gardens would deteriorate. The house itself might be demolished, as so many others were in those years. The sales began immediately and continued for 17 years. The Devonshire estates in Derbyshire, Yorkshire, Sussex, and Ireland were dismantled piece by piece. Hardwicke Hall, the magnificent Elizabethan mansion built by Bess of Hardwicke in the 1590s, was surrendered to the Treasury in lieu of duty and passed to the National Trust. Paintings by Rembrandt and Holbein were given to the nation. Thousands of acres of farmland were sold. The library was culled, silver was melted, furniture was auctioned. The numbers are staggering. In the 1950s, one English country house was demolished every 5 days. Between 1945 and 1975, over 1,000 country houses were destroyed, many by their own owners, who found demolition cheaper than maintenance. Death duties at rates between 65 and 80% had made inheritance functionally impossible for all but the wealthiest families. The Devonshires were wealthy. But even they could barely survive. Deborah watched the slow dismemberment of the estate with a pain she rarely expressed. She was not sentimental about objects. She was practical, clear-eyed, and tough. But Chatsworth was not merely an object. It was a community. It employed hundreds of people. It sustained a village. Its farms and woodlands and gardens represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and care. To lose Chatsworth was to lose not just a house, but a world. The final death duty payment was made in 1974. It had taken 24 years. The estate had been reduced by half, but Chatsworth survived. The house still stood. The art collection, though diminished, was still magnificent. And Deborah, who had expected to be terrifically poor, who had married a second son and wanted nothing more than chickens and a quiet life, now faced the next question. The house was saved. But could it live? Hashtag Chapter 10. The farm shop that saved an empire. Deborah Cavendish listed her occupation as housewife and built a business worth over £1 billion. She started with the house itself. Chatsworth had been occupied by a girls' school during the war. Penrose College had evacuated from Wales and taken up residence, 300 schoolgirls filling the state rooms, sleeping in the galleries, using the great dining room as a gymnasium. When the school left in 1946, the house was in poor condition. Paintwork was chipped, floors were scuffed, plumbing was unreliable. The gardens had been turned over to vegetable production. The fountains did not work. Deborah set about restoration with the systematic energy that was her particular gift. She cleaned. She repaired. She replumbed. She reopened rooms that had been closed for decades. She cataloged the collections. She installed proper heating. She created a route through the house that visitors could follow without getting lost. And then, she opened the doors. Chatsworth became one of the first great English houses to embrace tourism not as a necessary evil, but as a vocation. Deborah understood something that many of her contemporaries did not. The public was not a threat to the house. The public was its salvation. Every ticket sold was a contribution to the roof. Every postcard purchased helped pay a gardener. Every cream tea consumed in the orangery kept the fountains running for another day. By 2004, Chatsworth was receiving 500,000 visitors a year. The farm shop, which Deborah opened to sell produce from the estate's own farms, was generating £5 million in annual revenue. The Chatsworth brand extended to house plants, preserves, fabrics, and home furnishings. A duchess was running a retail empire from the kitchen table, where she still answered her own correspondence in longhand. The transformation was remarkable not just in scale, but in attitude. Deborah operated the ticket office herself on busy days. She stood behind the counter of the farm shop. She personally greeted visitors who had driven from the other end of England to see the house. She did this not because she had to, but because she believed it was her job. She had inherited a catastrophe and turned it into a community. The Chatsworth estate today encompasses roughly 35,000 acres, down from the 180,000 acres the family owned at its peak. It employs over 500 people. The house, gardens, and farm shop together form an economic engine that sustains the surrounding villages much as the estate always has, but through commerce rather than feudal obligation. The Devonshire Chatsworth Trust, established to ensure the house's long-term survival, holds assets valued at well over £1 billion. The transformation required Deborah to learn skills that no one in her family had ever needed. She learned bookkeeping. She learned marketing. She learned the particular art of managing seasonal staff, coordinating events, balancing the demands of conservation with the revenue requirements of a business. She did this without a university education, without business training, without any preparation beyond the practical common sense she had inherited from Sydney and the stubborn determination she shared with every one of her sisters. She also understood something about the English public that more sophisticated operators missed. People did not come to Chatsworth merely to see fine paintings or magnificent gardens. They came because they wanted to feel connected to something larger and older than themselves. Deborah gave them that connection. She made Chatsworth feel welcoming rather than intimidating. She put flowers in the Great Hall. She let children run on the lawn. She sold ice cream from a van in the car park. She understood that grandeur and warmth were not opposites. Deborah's achievement was to answer the question that the entire 20th century had posed to the English aristocracy. Could a great house survive in a democratic age? Could privilege justify itself through service? Could a duchess save an estate by selling jam? The answer, it turned out, was yes. But only if the duchess was Deborah Mitford. Chapter 11. The novelist, the muckraker, and the woman who never apologized. Nancy turned her family into fiction, Jessica turned injustice into headlines, and Diana went to her grave saying she regretted nothing. Nancy published The Pursuit of Love in 1945. It sold 200,000 copies in its first year. It made her famous. It made her, briefly, wealthy, and it preserved the Mitford childhood in amber, transformed into a comic novel so brilliantly observed that readers who had never seen a country house or met a baron felt they had grown up at Oakland alongside the Radlett children. The success was no accident. Nancy had been writing for 15 years, producing novels that were clever but slight, plays that were performed but forgotten, journalism that paid the rent but nothing more. She had served as a volunteer in an air raid precautions post during the Blitz, been a fire watcher, worked in a bookshop on Curzon Street. She knew what loss felt like. She knew what it meant to be cold, tired, and afraid. And she put all of it, the laughter and the terror, into a book that read like champagne, but tasted, underneath, of grief. Uncle Matthew, the terrifying patriarch of the novel, was David in all but name. The entrenching tool with which he had killed 8 Germans hung on the wall at Auchinleigh, just as it hung at Swinbrook. Aunt Sadie was Sydney, cool and remote and devoted to her health theories. The children were the Mitford sisters, lightly disguised and lovingly mocked. The novel captured something real about their childhood. The laughter, the cruelty, the boredom, the fierce attachments, and the absolute conviction that the outside world was inferior to the world inside the Hans cupboard. Nancy wrote the novel in Paris, where she had moved after the war to be near Gaston Paleski, the free French politician she loved with a devotion as total and unrequited as Unity's love for Hitler. Paleski was charming, brilliant, and unfaithful. He gave Nancy enough encouragement to sustain her hope and not enough commitment to justify it. She spent the rest of her life in France, writing novels, biographies, and letters of devastating wit, surrounded by friends and admirers, sustained by work, and privately desolate. She died in Versailles on the 30th of June, 1973, after a long illness. She was 69. The illness, diagnosed as Hodgkin's disease, caused years of agonizing pain. Nancy bore it with the dark comedy that had defined her life. When visitors asked how she was, she said she was dying of boredom. Jessica's American career was in every way the opposite of Nancy's European one. Where Nancy observed and satirized, Jessica investigated and campaigned. Her masterpiece was The American Way of Death, published in 1963. It was an expose of the American funeral industry, documenting the exorbitant costs, manipulative sales tactics, and grotesque embalming practices that the industry had normalized. The book caused a sensation. It triggered congressional hearings. It changed federal regulations. It made Jessica, in the words of Time magazine, the queen of the muckrakers. She followed it with investigations into the American prison system, the business of childbirth, and the funeral industry again in a revised edition published shortly before her death. She marched for civil rights in Alabama. She organized labor unions in Oakland. She taught writing at San Jose State University. She became, in every practical sense, the most consequential of the 6 sisters, the one whose work changed actual laws and saved actual people actual money. Jessica died on the 22nd of July, 1996, in Oakland. She was 78. Diana outlived them all except Deborah. She and Mosley lived in France after the war, first near Paris, then in a temple near Orsay. They were socially active, entertaining guests who included the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Diana wrote memoirs and biographies. She gave interviews. And in every interview, she was asked the same question. Did she regret her support for Hitler? She did not. She never wavered. She said Hitler had been charmed. She said the war had been unnecessary. She said the Holocaust, while terrible, had nothing to do with her. She maintained this position with perfect composure and utter conviction for more than 6 decades. She died in Paris on the 11th of August, 2003. She was 93. She had never apologized for anything. 3 sisters, 3 utterly different legacies. Nancy left behind literature. Jessica left behind justice. Diana left behind a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. What combination of intelligence, beauty, and privilege produces a woman who can look at the 20th century's greatest crime and see only a dinner party she enjoyed? Hashtag Chapter 12, the churchyard where they all came home. In the graveyard of St. Mary's Church at Swinbrook, the sisters who scattered across the century lie side by side at last. The churchyard is small. The church is Norman, rebuilt in the 13th century, modest and gray, and set on a gentle slope above the Windrush Valley. The Mitford graves cluster together near the eastern boundary. David is here. Nancy is here. Unity is here. Pamela, who died in 2008 at the age of 100, is here. Diana, whose ashes were brought from Paris, is here. They are within yards of each other. The sisters who divided across fascism and communism, across Hitler and Marx, across prison and exile, lie in the same quiet English earth where they once played as children. His body lies in Burma, in the military cemetery at Tokyan, near Rangoon. A memorial tablet inside the church remembers him. It bears his name, his regiment, and the date of his death. It says nothing about the sisters who loved him, or the war that killed him, or the family that never recovered from his loss. Jessica is not here either. She is buried in Oakland, California, far from the Cotswolds, far from the linen cupboard. She had made her choice decades earlier, and she did not reverse it in death. She belonged to America, to the movement, to the future she had built with her running away pennies and her unshakable belief that the world could be made more fair. Deborah was the last to go. She died on the 24th of September, 2014, at the age of 94. She had spent her final years at Chatsworth, the house she had saved, surrounded by the gardens she had restored and the farm shop she had built. She had outlived all 5 of her sisters. She had outlived the world they were born into. She had outlived the aristocratic certainties that had shaped them and the political extremes that had destroyed them. She simply outlived. In 2024, Unity's diaries were discovered. They had been stored in the attic of a family home, unseen for decades. Their contents, still being studied as this story is told, confirmed what had long been suspected and revealed much that had not been known. The red ink entries. The word angel. The 140 meetings. The diaries gave Unity a voice beyond the headlines. A voice that was at once terrifyingly naive and heartbreakingly human. The Mitford story is often told as a comedy. The pet snakes, the Hans cupboard, the nicknames, the outrageous pronouncements. Nancy herself set the template, turning tragedy into farce, because that was the only way she knew to make it bearable. And there is comedy in it. There is something genuinely funny about a family that could produce a communist, a fascist, a duchess, and a woman who kept chickens, all from the same nursery. But the comedy hides a darker truth. The Mitford sisters were not anomalies. They were products. They were produced by a class that had ruled England for centuries, and that by the 1920s had lost its reason for existing. The land was taxed. The money was gone. The servants had left. The houses were crumbling. And into this vacuum of purpose, 6 brilliant, undereducated, chronically bored young women went looking for something to believe in. 2 of them found fascism. 1 found communism. 1 found literature. 1 found farming. 1 found a farm shop. The range is absurd. It is also logical. When you have been raised with absolute confidence and absolute uselessness, when you have been told that you matter enormously but given nothing to do, you will reach for the nearest source of meaning available. And in the 1930s, the nearest sources of meaning were the most dangerous ones. Privilege without purpose is a loaded weapon. The Mitford sisters prove it. They prove it in Unity's diaries, and Diana's unrepentance, and Jessica's exile, and Nancy's bitter, brilliant novels. They prove it in Deborah's farm shop, which survives, because Deborah understood what none of her sisters ever did. Purpose is not something you find. It is something you build, plank by plank, jar by jar, ticket by ticket, day by day. The churchyard at Swinbrook is quiet. The tourists who come, and they do come, walk among the graves with a particular hush of people who understand they are standing in the presence of something they cannot quite explain. 6 sisters, 1 nursery, a century of wreckage and wonder. The stones say nothing about any of it. They bear only names and dates, the way English graves always do.